I'm sure every one of us here have been in one of those situations where, whether in a classroom or maybe in a meeting at work or maybe even a Bible study with someone, we were trying to get people to ask questions, or we were the ones that people were trying to get us to ask questions. And usually the moderator or teacher or leader will say something like, "Now don't be afraid. There's no such thing as a bad question. There's no such thing as a silly question." And that's designed to try and encourage everybody to speak up, to realize that questions should be asked, and we shouldn't be afraid of showing ignorance because we need to ask questions if we're going to learn. And that all sounds nice, but if you're like me, you sit there and that really doesn't convince you to ask a question per se, because you've heard plenty of questions in your life and you thought, there are such things as bad questions, and there are silly questions. And so bad questions really do exist. Now, through the Bible, we find a lot of questions. I've always been intrigued by some of the questions that get asked in the Bible. You know, in Jesus' ministry, there's a lot of times that he's asked questions. There's a lot of times that he asks questions of others. And I think when there are questions that are posed in the biblical text, there's some interesting things that we can learn. But recently, in fact, it was this past Sunday when David was speaking, was kind of the catalyst for this idea, when he was talking about Pharaoh, and we'll mention that very briefly in our lesson tonight, when Pharaoh asks the question, "Who is the Lord that I should obey him?" And I thought, that's a terrible question. That was a really bad question for Pharaoh to ask. And as I started thinking about that, I thought, you know, there's other times in the Bible that people ask some really bad questions. And the reason that the questions are bad is not because they should be smarter or they should know better, but often the bad questions that we can read about in the Bible, they portray or they reveal something bad about the person. They reveal bad hearts. They reveal bad attitudes. They reveal bad motives. And so for just a little while tonight, I want to go through several. I don't know if we'll get through all the ones that I have in the PowerPoint here, but I want to go through several times in the Bible that we read some questions that people ask that are bad questions. First, we'll talk about in Genesis chapter 4, and we've covered this not too long ago in our biggest story series that we've been going through. But the story of Cain and Abel is a story that we know very well. We're told there in Genesis 4 that Adam and Eve had a son, and they named him Cain, and they had another son that they named Abel. And of course, Cain was a tiller of the ground. Basically, he was a farmer, and yet Abel was a keeper of sheep. He was a shepherd. And at a point in time, they both brought forth offerings. Abel's was accepted. Cain's was rejected. Cain was upset about that. And God, of course, had a wonderful question for Cain. He said, "If you do well, will you not be accepted?" But he warns him to be diligent because sin is crouching at the door, and its desire was for Cain, but he could overcome it. But instead of listening to that advice, instead of learning from the Lord, Cain let his anger continue to grow, and a day came when, of course, he rose up in the field, and we're told that he murdered his brother Abel. Now, we don't know what he did with the body. We don't know how long it was after that event, but at some point, God came to the Lord in Genesis 4, verse 9, and asks Cain, "Where is Abel your brother?" And Cain responds by saying, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" Now, first of all, I think we can see just the lie that comes out in the statement when he says, "I do not know." Cain knew exactly where his brother was. He was lying dead somewhere, maybe buried, maybe hidden, but he was dead. Of course, God knew this too, and the point of God's question was to call out Cain's guilt. But we see here in this question that follows the statement just continues the dishonesty. This is not a question that is good and right. It's a question that is based in deceit. You know, sometimes we think of deceit and lies as statements. We make positive statements that are contrary to the truth. But you know, there are such things as dishonest questions. In fact, sometimes people that are really masters of deception, one of the reasons that they're so masterful at it is they don't just tell a straightforward lie that's easy to catch. Think of Satan in the garden. Sometimes they kind of mix truth with error, or they kind of bury half-truths into their statements. Or sometimes they're even able to ask questions in such a way that can lead you astray from where they really want you to be or from where the truth is. And that's really what Cain is trying to do. He's trying to deflect from this question. God has asked, where is your brother? And he's trying to deflect away from this. And he says, am I my brother's keeper? Now, something else here, not only do we see dishonesty, but we also see within this answer, I think, something that it tells us something about Cain, and that is there is no remorse. Now, you see later when God gives out the punishment, all of a sudden Cain decides that it's bad, and he thinks the punishment is more than he can bear, and God grants even Cain a measure of mercy. But this man has not worshiped God correctly, and it doesn't seem that he has changed. His heart hasn't changed. In fact, it moved him to such hatred of his righteous brother that he murdered him. And when God confronts him and he has an opportunity to confess what he has done and come clean, he's aloof, he is dishonest, and he has absolutely no remorse whatsoever. He is unrepentant. And I think this question and this ability to cover up his sin and this cold-hearted attitude is displayed in the question that he asks. But then perhaps worst of all is the assumption. It almost feels like a rhetorical question when he says, am I my brother's keeper? Cain indicates the answer to that is no. But the answer to that question is a resounding yes. Now, Abel was probably an adult man. He was responsible for himself. But Cain is the older brother, according to the order of the text. This is his family. This is another individual who has been created in the image of God. Now, he may not have been responsible for micromanaging Abel. He wasn't responsible for the choices that Abel made or didn't make. He wouldn't have been held liable if Abel had chosen to sin, and he wasn't righteous because his brother was righteous. But as his brother, yes, he most certainly had some responsibilities in a relationship to this man, to help him, to protect him, certainly to not cause him harm and murder him. And so this question, it shows his own arrogance. It shows his own misunderstanding of the relationship that he should have had, even if he could say that he wasn't his brother's keeper. That didn't justify murder. And so we see in this question a man who is dishonest and unrepentant, and a man who is unloving. Sometimes questions can reveal a great deal about people. But then also, keeping in the early stories of the Bible, what David talked about, so we won't talk too much about this, but remember when Moses initially goes to Pharaoh with that message that God wants Pharaoh to let the people go out into the wilderness to worship. And Pharaoh says, who is the Lord that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and moreover, I will not let Israel go. I think this question shows us a lot about Pharaoh. One, this is a very arrogant question. Sometimes people ask arrogant questions. People ask questions in a way to be condescending, in a way to put others down. And that's exactly what Pharaoh is doing. Pharaoh is lifting himself up with this question. Have you ever had someone question, who are you? Who are you to question me? Or what are your credentials to tell me what to do? The point of that question is to put you down a bit, to say, you have no right to tell me what to do. I don't need to listen to you. Now, Pharaoh is saying this about God. Now, the other thing that not only does this question display arrogance, but it shows his stubbornness. He says, I will not let Israel go. Here is God Almighty giving a direct command. Pharaoh may be a powerful person, but he is not God. And yet, he is willing to stick by his guns. He's willing to be stubborn and continue to disobey the Lord. But also, this question, let's try and put the most positive spin you could on it. Maybe Pharaoh did not know God. Of course, he's grown up as an Egyptian. He's grown up in the household of Pharaoh himself, and then he becomes Pharaoh. He's been surrounded all of his life by false deities. He probably has been taught to some degree that he himself is deified, or at least an arbiter of the gods. And so he may legitimately not know who this Yahweh is, even though he has an entire slave population that comes from Jacob's descendants, people that knew and worshiped God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Maybe he didn't know about this God, but that was no excuse. And his attitude precluded him from learning. He didn't want to learn about God. He didn't want to learn the truth. He wanted to hold on to power. And that's very obvious because as God begins to rain down the plagues upon Egypt, maybe at the beginning we could understand that attitude. But surely after 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 miracles, this man would recognize who God is. At least that God is more powerful than him. At least that God is more powerful than the gods he believes exist in Egypt. And yet I think the question that he asks is a question that really gets down to the heart of the matter, and that is that he was hard-hearted. And he wasn't going to listen to God no matter what. And that proves truth of the story. He finally lets the Israelites go only to chase them down, and it's only in his death that he finally ceases to oppose God because his life is snuffed out. But his question really sets the tenor of this man's life, and what a sad one that is. Now, I'd like to fast forward quite a bit of time in Israel's history to 2 Kings chapter 6. In 2 Kings chapter 6, Ahab's son, Jehoram, is reigning as the king of Israel. And Ahab, of course, if you remember from the biblical story, was a terrible man and a terrible king. And his son was a little better. The Bible tells us that he didn't go to all of the excess that Ahab and Jezebel had, but he still was a wicked king. And he still was an idolatrous king and an evil man. And him and the prophet Elisha had many, many run-ins. They had multiple times where they were kind of bickering back and forth. They had harsh words for each other. But all that, Elisha still helped this king. He had helped when Naaman, the Syrian commander with leprosy, came demanding to be cured, and Jehoram had no idea what to do. Elisha sent and said, "Don't worry, send him here." And Naaman ends up healed. When the Syrians were raiding Israel, God would tell to Elisha where those armies were going to come, and he would be able to tell the armies, and they would be able to evacuate before the Syrians arrived. And there's several stories where Elisha is helping, and he is helpful. But Jehoram still didn't like this man because he was a preacher of the truth. And so a time comes when Syria besieges Samaria, and they besiege the capital city. And things get so bleak and so terrible that we're told people were eating donkeys' heads and people were eating dove's dung, and they were paying exorbitant prices even for those things. And Jehoram seems to have at least a little bit of a repentant attitude for a while. We're told that one day he was out walking on the wall and he was wearing sackcloth underneath his clothes. This was a sign of penitence. But as he's walking on the wall, this woman calls out to him. She recognizes it's the king and she has this need. And he asks her what her need is. And she tells him, she says that she and this other woman both had 2 children. They had young babies and they were starving. And so they made an agreement, a grotesque agreement, that they would kill and eat one of the children. And then when that was over, they would kill the other woman's child. But after they've killed and eaten one of the children, the mother of the surviving child can't bear the idea, and so she hides the child. And the other woman, who had gone ahead and let her child be murdered, is mad. And she wants vengeance. And she calls out to the king. And Jehoram is rightfully outraged. That's a disgusting story. That's a terrible story to hear. And Jehoram is outraged. But you know who he gets mad at? Elisha. In fact, he says, "God do so to me and more also if by this time tomorrow I have not lifted Elisha's head from his shoulders." Now, the problem with the kingdom was Jehoram's fault. He was the leader who was allowing and leading the country into idolatry. He was the one that was disobeying God, and people were following his example. He was to blame for this miserable situation. But as is often the case, when people get into trouble because of their sin, they want to blame someone else. And often they look to righteous people to blame. It's exactly what Jehoram did. And so Jehoram sends his execution squad basically down to Elisha's house. And Elisha is not afraid. In fact, he tells the servants, he says, look, the king has sent his men to come after my head. And it says that while he was still speaking, the messenger came down to him and said, and this is the message that is from Jehoram, why should I wait for the Lord any longer? Now, I can't imagine what it must have been like to be besieged. I've heard, we read about it in the Bible. I've heard histories about cities that were besieged, or maybe we see it sometimes portrayed on television or movies. And I've always thought that would be such a terrifying experience, to be cooped up in the walls of a city, running out of food, running out of water, running out of supplies, disease rampant, starvation kicking in. That would be a terrible situation. And it would be a situation that would try any person's faith. But Jehoram had lost all faith in God. He had been idolatrous his whole life, and now he's blaming God and saying, why should I wait on the Lord? Why should I wait for the Lord to do anything else? Now, I don't know what else he was planning on doing. But this man had not listened to the word. If he would have just read a few of David's words, he would have known how silly, how foolish this question was. Psalm 27, verse 33, David said, or in Psalm 31, verse 24, be strong and let your heart take courage, all you who wait for the Lord. I didn't put all of them in my notes, but there's about half a dozen verses just through the Psalms, many of which were written by David, that specifically say, wait for the Lord. Proverbs 20 and verse 22 says, do not say, I will repay evil. Wait for the Lord, and he will deliver you. True faith is patient. True faith is long-suffering, and true faith endures, even in difficult circumstances. Weak faith, or non-existent faith, gives up on God. And this question displays Jehoram's true nature. He did not trust God, and he did not have faith in the Lord. And so he sought to take things into his own hands. Now, this would have been, ideally, to us, probably a great time for Jehoram to be struck down. But he's not. In fact, Elisha tells this messenger that by that time the next day, they will be able to buy grain and wheat at incredibly cheap prices. They're paying exorbitant prices for donkey's head and dove's dung. And by tomorrow, there will be so much surplus of grain and wheat and bread that they'll be paying pennies on the dollar, essentially, because of what God is going to do. Jehoram wants to question God. God's going to show his power. But this leads us to our next bad question. There's the captain of the guard, the captain that's one of the king's right-hand men, is standing there, and he asks Elisha when he makes this proclamation, if the Lord himself should make windows in heaven, could this thing be? But he said, that's Elisha, you shall see it with your own eyes, but you shall not eat of it. This man asks a question that displays his doubt. When Elisha says that they're going to go from famine to great excess in the period of 24 hours, this man not only says, that sounds a bit far-fetched, he doesn't just say, that sounds a little too good to be true. He says, if God himself opened up the storehouses of heaven, could that even happen? What a blasphemous question. This question is indicating that God is not powerful enough to overcome human problems. It was a big problem, that siege. But surely that's nothing for the God of heaven. And God, of course, proved to be true. That day, we're told another story about the lepers that were outside and who decided to go to the enemy's camp to see if they could find food or mercy or a quick death at the very least. But by the time they get there, the camp's empty. Overnight, the army had heard sounds that weren't even there, but God had made them hear sounds, and they thought for sure that the Israelites had hired other kings and other armies, and they were about to be ambushed. And so they ran for their lives. They left their tents, they left their food, they left their clothes, they left their weapons and their gold and their silver. They left everything, and they just ran. And when those lepers got to the camp, they found a fully stocked camp with no enemy soldiers. And they come back and they tell the good news to the people, and by this time it's the next day. And that very same captain is somewhere by the gate when this happens. And when the people hear that there's an entire camp's worth of food and provisions and clothes and wealth, they stampede out that door. And that captain is trampled to death. He heard about the salvation that God had worked, and he never tasted a bit of it because of his faithlessness, because of his blasphemy, because he doubted God. But that question displayed a terrible heart within that man. Let's go to the New Testament and consider some bad questions that are asked, especially in the life of Jesus. First comes from some men who are actually good men. They're wonderful men, but sometimes even good people can ask bad questions. In Luke chapter 9, we read about a time when Jesus was traveling and he came through a town in Samaria. Now, there were times in the Lord's life that he traveled through Samaria and received a warm welcome. John 4 tells us about the conversation Jesus had with the woman at the well in Samaria, and she goes and tells the town that she thinks it's the Messiah, and the town welcomes him, and he spends several days there, and many believe in him. But in Luke 9, Jesus passes through a town, but because he's clearly a Jew, and there's this hatred between the Jews and Samaritans, they will not welcome him. They will not basically let him in the town. They don't want him to be there. I'm sure they were rude. They were hateful. And this made James and John mad. And so James and John, it says, they come to the Lord and they say, "Lord, do you want us to call down fire from heaven to consume them?" Now, a couple of things about this question that might seem good. First of all, I think it's commendable that they cared about the Lord's reputation and the way people treated the Lord. When people dishonored the Lord, that upset these men. They couldn't just stand by and watch people mistreat the Lord and be okay with it. And I think that's commendable. I also have to commend their boldness. I mean, these men seem to think that they have it within themselves, that the Lord is powerful enough that if they just ask for fire to come down, like Elijah did upon Mount Carmel, that fire is going to come down and burn these people up. I mean, that's some impressive faith. That's some impressive boldness in what they believe. But boldness and zeal are dangerous when they are not tempered by knowledge, when they are not tempered by mercy, and when they are not tempered by Christ likeness. We're told Jesus doesn't turn around and say, "That's very nice of you guys, but let's not worry about it now." It says that he turned and he rebuked them. Jesus rebuked James and John because they were taking vengeance into their own hands, because their hearts were not right in this matter, and so he rebuked them. Boldness and zeal are not an excuse for going against the Lord. Sometimes people say things that they shouldn't say. Sometimes people do things that they shouldn't do. And they say, "I was just so caught up." They say, "Well, I was misguided." It's not an excuse. Misguided, just like Pharaoh's ignorance, it's not an excuse. We need to learn from the Lord, and we need to follow the Lord. That means our hearts need to be like his. There will come a day of judgment for those that mistreat and rebel against and blaspheme the Lord. But that day will come at the Lord's choosing and by the Lord's hand. Our job is not to call down vengeance and justice upon such people. Our job is to preach the gospel. Our job is to be a light and to influence as many as we can and leave judgment to the Lord. Another question in the life of Jesus that I think was a bad question. Now, in some ways it was a good question, but the motivation behind it made it a bad question, comes in Luke chapter 10. a man had stood up to test Jesus and asked him about the greatest commands in the law, or what he needed to do to inherit eternal life. And Jesus quotes the first great commandment, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul. And he says the second like it is to love your neighbor as yourself. And he says, do this and you will live. But in Luke 10, verse 29, we're told that this lawyer asks, and who is my neighbor? Now, if that was asked because he wants to know so that he can truly love his neighbor, that would be one thing. But Luke tells us that he, desiring to justify himself, said to Jesus, who is my neighbor? When we ask questions, before we ask them, we should ask ourselves, why am I asking this question? Now, if we are asking a question to learn, if we are asking a question to get closer to truth, then that's a great question. But when we ask questions to justify ourselves, we've seen questions that have been asked to deceive, we've seen questions that have been asked in order to condescend, and now we see a question that's being asked as some way to justify himself. This man didn't apparently like it when Jesus said, not only should you love God, you should love your fellow man, you should love your neighbor as yourself. He didn't really like that. And the way to get around something you don't like is to call it into question, to shed some doubt over the topic. Now, sadly, there's a lot of people that do that. Politics, this happens all the time. If you can't win the argument, ask enough questions to confuse everybody about the issue. Now, that's not honest questions, but many people do that. I think that's what this man is trying to do. And in so doing, justify himself. But Jesus went ahead and gave the man an answer. Now, there are times in Jesus' life when people asked bad questions and Jesus did not answer them. Or Jesus gave them the answer they needed, not the answer they asked for. But in this occasion, even though the man asks a bad question, or at least a badly motivated question, Jesus gives a good answer. And he gives the story, the parable of the Good Samaritan. He tells about this man who is beaten on the road to Jericho, and this priest and this Levite and other individual walk by, and they just leave him there. He's been beaten and robbed and left for dead, but then a Samaritan comes by, and he binds up his wounds, and he takes care of him, and he takes him to an inn and makes sure he gets the care he needs, and he promises to pay the expenses of this man when he comes back. And he asks the man at the end of the story, he says, who do you think was a neighbor to that man? That lawyer had to grudgingly admit it was the Samaritan. It was the one who met his needs. And Jesus told the man at the end of that, he said, you go and do likewise. Have you ever thought about how insulting that message would have been to this man? And Jesus wasn't saying it just to insult him, but you go and be like this Samaritan, that you hate Samaritans, you look down on Samaritans. You go be like the Samaritan in this story. Jesus answered the question, even though it was a bad question. And sometimes we need to use wisdom. There are questions that don't need to be answered. But then there are some times that even bad questions can give us an opportunity to provide good answers. But we also should always ask ourselves, as I said, why are we asking the questions in the first place? Now, another question that was asked during the life of Jesus came from his disciples, and I think this was an honest question. This was not a poorly motivated question, but it displayed a lack of trust and faith, even in some great men. In Mark chapter 4, we're told about the storm on the Sea of Galilee as they're sailing from Capernaum across the sea overnight. A storm comes up that endangers the lives. We're told that the boat was filling with water, and the disciples can tell that the boat is about to sink, and yet Jesus is asleep on a pillow. And Mark 4:38 says that they woke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" What a question. Can you imagine Jesus being woken up? He's so exhausted that he's able to sleep through a windstorm on a boat. And he's roughly woken, and the first thing he hears from his disciples is, "Do you not care that we are perishing?" Why was Jesus so tired that he could sleep in the stern of a boat in a windstorm in the first place? Because he had left the throne room of heaven to put on mortal flesh, to live among men, to preach the good news to men, to walk that journey to the cross that was looming, to give his life, all because he cared immensely that mankind was perishing. But one windstorm, and I don't want to be too harsh on the disciples because I highly doubt I would have been any better in that situation. But one windstorm and one threat was able to cause them to doubt. In fact, Jesus, when he got up, we're told he rebuked the wind and he said, "Peace, be still," and there was a great calm. And then he asked them, "Oh, you of little faith, why do you still doubt?" What a stinging question that must have been. When they watched Jesus with his very words take care of what they were hopeless to fight against. And as they realized they were in no danger if they were next to Jesus, and yet they had called his very motives into question. Do we ever ask such questions? We look at that story and think, how could they ask that? Do we ask that? I doubt any of us ever ask that out loud. But in our own minds and our own hearts, when things go bad and things are tough, do we ask God if he really cares? Do we begin to wonder if he's actually watching? Do we question the Lord and let doubt creep in because of hardship? These questions may not be spoken, but perhaps they are there. Another question, that was actually a wonderful question, but I think bad from the man who asked it, is the famous question of Pilate. As Jesus is, of course, there on trial, and Pilate's asking him about his kingdom and his kingship, and he can tell that there's something not quite right with the situation. But Jesus is very clear that his kingdom is not of this world. His kingdom is not going to be filled with physical soldiers that are going to violently take care of his enemies. But he says something about those who seek the truth being a part of his kingdom. And Pilate asks in Luke 10, verse 29, what is truth? Like I said, I think that is a wonderful question if it's asked in honesty. But it doesn't appear that's the case for Pilate. Now, I don't know. I've heard all sorts of suggestions, and we're just not given enough details, I think, to know exactly Pilate's mindset. Maybe this is asked in sarcasm. What's this man speaking about truth? Maybe it's asked in cynicism. Maybe Pilate has just seen the evils of the world so much, and here's another case of people just hating someone and trying to get rid of him, and he's in a difficult situation. There's no such thing as truth. There's just what gets you through the day. Maybe it's exasperation. He's tired of dealing with these. But whatever the motivation, it wasn't honest seeking. Because Pilate had in front of him, literally feet away, talking with him, the very embodiment of truth. And yet he wouldn't see it. Couldn't see it because of his own blindness and hard-heartedness and desires for power and control and whatever else went into Pilate's motivations that day. Now, I think people sometimes still ask these questions. And they sound good. But they aren't asking questions because they're looking for answers. They're asking questions just to ask questions. And just because we question the truth doesn't mean we're looking for the truth. How many people have asked what is the will of God, and yet they've never picked up the Word of God? How many people question what is right and what is wrong, but they never look to the Holy Scriptures to see what is right and wrong? And it sounds good that people are questioning and seeking and all of those things, but they aren't actually listening. And that's Pilate that day. And sometimes, if we're not careful, perhaps it could be us. Also, Pilate reminds us that just because we question the truth doesn't mean we won't be judged by the truth. Again, maybe Pilate thought he possessed truth. Maybe Pilate thought truth didn't exist. But unless Pilate, later in his life and history, doesn't seem to indicate this is true, but unless Pilate changed his ways and repented and obeyed the gospel, he's going to stand before Jesus one day, not as Jesus' judge, but with Jesus as the judge. And he will be judged by the truth. His exasperation and cynicism and control that day didn't change the fact that he will be judged by the truth. And you and I are no different. One day we will stand before the judgment seat of Christ. Whatever excuses we've made, whatever blinders we've allowed to be put on, if we do not listen to the Word of God and obey it, then we will be judged by the truth as well. Another example of a bad question, I think, again, from a good man and a wonderful man, but Peter, in John 21, after that scene where Jesus has kind of restored Peter, he's asked those questions, do you love me? He says, yes, Lord, I love you. And Jesus says, feed my sheep. After that, Jesus tells Peter basically that he's going to die for him one day. And he says, when you were a young man, you went where you wished, but when you're old, others are going to carry you where you do not wish. And John says that he spoke that, signifying by the way that Peter would die. And so Jesus has just told Peter that if you follow me, you're going to die for it. But then in verse 21, we're told that when Peter looks behind Jesus, he sees John. He sees that disciple that Jesus loved, and that's John's way of referring to himself. And he sees John kind of following behind. And in verse 21, he says, Lord, what about this man? You know, this is a question that we ask in so many ways. We have responsibilities, we have struggles, we have our things that we need to take care of, but we always want to be looking at someone else. Sure, I've got this problem, but brother so-and-so has that problem. Sure, I should do more, but sister so-and-so could do a whole lot more. This is what I need to do, but what are they going to do? We always are looking to other people. And right after Jesus tells Peter about his fate, he looks to John and he says, well, what about him? And Jesus makes the comment, he says, if I will that he remain till I come, what is that to you? You follow me. Whatever brother so-and-so does, whatever sister so-and-so does or does not do, really doesn't matter, does it? Now, we should be encouraging, and yes, we need to rebuke error, and we should exhort and help, but at the end of the day, I can't control what you do. You can't control what I do. This is when I've had, in the few times that I've been involved with trying to help people with some form of marriage counseling, not in a professional sense, but just trying to help people work through problems. One of the things that I've often told people, husbands and wives, is you cannot control your spouse. Sometimes husbands say, my wife is not submissive. I say, guess what? You can't make her submissive. That's not the way that this works. What you can do is you can love your wife like the Lord loves the church. And you can honor her. And you can love her. And you can do your job. And that may encourage her to do what she ought to do. Or it may not. And you can't change that. But it doesn't alleviate you from your responsibility. Same to wife. Sometimes wives say, my husband doesn't love me the way he ought to. Okay? That doesn't give you a right to not be the wife that you're supposed to be. You can't control him, but you can do your part. And that's probably going to encourage him to do his part, but whether he does or not, you are responsible for you. And that's something we always need to remember. Yes, help one another, be examples for one another, serve one another, but at the end of the day, the only thing I can really control are my actions. Even if everybody else proves faithless, will you prove faithful? Don't ask, what about this man? Just follow the Lord. Question that I think, we've got two more here that I'll get through quickly. This was a question asked by some Jewish leaders I saw something about this some time back, and it's kind of been on my mind. I think it's an interesting point to be made. And when Judas betrayed Jesus, we all know that story well. He got the 30 pieces of silver. But we're told in Matthew 27 that when he saw that Jesus was condemned, he changed his mind and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders, saying, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. They said, what is that to us? See to it yourself. Now, I think we overlook this story a lot because we're so disgusted by Judas. And rightfully so. Judas did a terrible thing. After this event, Judas makes another terrible decision. But here's a question for you to consider. What if the men that Judas had gone to had been godly men that listened to his question? Judas had made an awful decision. And when he came, he had changed his mind. This man was on the doorstep, perhaps, of repentance. And he came to the Jewish leaders and he confessed what he had done. He confessed it was wrong. And they said, what does that matter to us? Why should we care? You go take care of it. And with that discouraging word, he let the doubt overcome him and he went and took his own life. I'm not trying to get Judas off the hook here. But what a terrible failure of leadership in that case. And for those of us who are in leadership, let me say this. I need to preface this. My 6.5, 7 years here, however long it's been, I feel very blessed. We have not had a lot of problems. We've not had a lot of issues, and I hope it stays that way. But I've talked with enough church leaders and preachers and elders across the country to know that that's not the way life goes. Sometimes things go wrong, and sometimes things go really wrong. And I know church leaders who have had to deal with some serious situations and problems. And sometimes when people come to you and they have really messed up their lives, and they have really made some big mistakes, it's tempting to say, it's not my problem. You made this bed, you lie down in it. Basically, it's easy for us to take the position of these Jewish leaders and say, what is that to us? You take care of it. That is not the role of a godly leader. Sometimes people are going to need severe rebuke. Sometimes people are going to need severe correction. Sometimes people are going to need a lot of work. But that's what we're supposed to do. When we turn a cold and indifferent ear to those who are in need, even those who have made mistakes, and we simply ask, what is that to us? That's a big problem, because it means a lot to the Lord. I don't know what would have happened if these men would have actually listened. Obviously, they were covering up their own sin. That's part of the problem. But I hope it is never said of any of us that we have such an attitude and ask such a question. One last question. Are you the Christ? Mark 14 is the account of Jesus' trial. And we're told that he remained silent to the questioning, and when he made no answer, the high priest asked him, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? And Jesus said, I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. This was an incredible question. Great question. Are you the Christ? This is the question that I think every Jewish person looked forward to asking and hearing the answer yes, because they longed for the Messiah, or at least they thought they did. These men had God's Messiah right in front of them. And he answered their question. He said, I am. And their answer to that was, he has spoken blasphemy, and he deserves death. You know what that means? It means that their question was a dishonest question from the start. They asked that question trying to condemn him. They weren't asking that question looking for truth. This was a trial. They didn't care about truth. The dishonesty had a hold on their hearts, And whether it was their despite for Jesus, whether it was their lust for power, or any and all of those things, they were no better than Pilate. You know, we need to ask ourselves, are we asking honest questions? And are we ready for honest answers? Sometimes the questions we ask may garner answers that we don't really want. Sometimes we go to the scriptures looking for guidance, and we get it. It's not quite what we wanted it to say. The question is, are we going to listen, or are we going to reject it? Jesus spoke truth to those men. Jesus was who they had looked for, and yet they denied him. You know, that's a question that we should all be thinking of. Is Jesus the Christ? The Bible, I think, clearly shows us that he is. But the question is, how will we respond? Will we give him our allegiance and our loyalty? Will we faithfully serve him? Or will we turn away from him? And in our own lust for control of our lives, and our own doubts and whatever it may be, will we reject his lordship as the Son of God and as the Christ? Or will we submit to him and serve him?